Hey everybody, Steve the Amateur Historian, your favorite amateur historian, lingering in one of the oldest parts of Portland, just in terms of like the age of the buildings in this area. This one was built like early 1880s, this one's late 1880s. There's some buildings from the 1850s, like see this? You can kind of see over this building. Nope, you can't see it, but anyway, there's part of a roof showing up here of a 3-story building. That building was built, I think, in 1859. Some of the oldest buildings around are in this area. I just love being in this area. Has nothing to do with my video today. I'm just starting from here because I'm actually only a block away from kind of where I want to get things started. This video is going to delve into something that I haven't really addressed much, and there actually were a lot of murders that happened in Portland in relation to things like this, and I haven't really discussed it much, and it was the concept of tong wars that occurred between Chinese gangs that lived in this area. Like today, we see Chinatown north of Burnside, which is just a couple blocks this way. That's what we think about when we think of Chinatown today. So if you don't know your history, you might think like that's just where the Chinese populace has always been. But right where I am right now, this was very prominent Chinese neighborhood with Chinese immigrants. I do a video about a woman named Gong Fa, who was a young woman who had her throat slit and was left to die, and they never really solved her crime. And she was killed literally. The block I'm on now, you go diagonal right through these buildings to the next block down there. That's where that happened. So this area actually was predominantly where Portland's Chinese population lived at one time. And my story in particular begins right here because this is the intersection of Southwest 2nd and Oak. And taking you back to possibly one of the most prominent examples in this city of a murder, the result of a tong war that was going on between, rivals in this city. So first things first, I noticed in all these newspapers and then even historical documents, this spelling and even the names themselves of people that I'm going to discuss in this video changed repeatedly. So I'm doing the best I can with what I was given. Like, the main guy in this case was a Chinese man named Woon. I saw Woon, W-O-N, but sometimes I saw it as Woom, W-O-M. I'm going with Woon because more later documents and stuff that might be a little bit more reliable refer to him in that way. Woon was living with a guy named, I'm going with Gueng. I saw it as like G-I-E-N-G, G-U-E-N-G. I'm going with Gueng as the pronunciation. Again, I could be wrong about that. Those two guys were living with another, I'm having to look at as, some people in the story I'm just going to reference as that random person, because there's too many names to remember. But they were living with a Joe Bong. So you've got Woon, Jing, and Bong as the last names of the three individuals who were seemingly roommates together, but they were members of the Bow On Tong. And they lived, I don't know which corner, but they lived in a building at this intersection of 2nd and Oak. And it's crazy because here's the police headquarters right here. They're also located at 2nd and Oak. I think this building was built a little bit after this case took place, but it had always been here. Like before this building, there was another police headquarters there. The police headquarters here date back to the 1800s. So police headquarters were here, and these three members of the Bow On Tong were living right at the same intersection. You'd think three people who probably want to lay low, but what I learned, and I admit it right away, I don't know much about the history of Tong fights in Chinese history, Chinese culture. I'm trying to address them as directly and honestly as I can, but the way it's reported in news reports back then, and mind you, this is 1908 we're talking about in this case, the Bow On Tong had kind of a split. Members were apparently going in different directions in terms of what they wanted. There was tensions building, and this was leading to a great deal of tension, a great deal of animosity between what was now becoming like two different factions of this particular Tong. And the story that ultimately kind of carried the day in the newspapers was the Bow On Tong group out of San Francisco, California, had actually targeted four different people, Tong members who apparently had gone the opposite way of where they wanted them to. 4 Tong members to have assassinated. Why it was these specific 4, I'm not sure. Maybe they had come to pretty great prominence in this city. Maybe they had just been causing more trouble than others. But for whatever the case, it got reported to the police up here from San Francisco authorities that, you know, it seemed like the Bow On Tong was sending assassins up here to take out other members of like their, you know, once connected as one group. And the idea was pressed forward that Woon and Gueng, I have to check every time, at least those 2 were brought up here, or at least brought on to take part in these assassination attempts. That was the idea that was being put forth. So it's March 7th, 1908. Woon and Gueng and reportedly another person. There was at least one witness that said they saw 3 people fleeing from the crime scene. They leave their home here and they likely start heading in this direction. They were only traveling a couple of blocks to do what they had to do, but they were heading towards the southeast corner of 4th and Pine, which is pretty much right in this direction. So right back here where this headlight is, that's 4th and Pine. The southeast corner of 4th and Pine is this structure behind me, which looks like it was a building at one time that's been fashioned into a garage. There's still like a couple businesses on the ground floor. But this wasn't here in 1908. In 1908, there was a build. It almost looked like a house. I've only been able to find one picture of it, and I feel wholly grateful that I was able to find even that one picture. But it was a place that had been, I want to say it was called the Anderson Club. It was, you know, one of these, you know, men get together, get away from their wives and talk politics and what's best for the world type places. Sit down in cushiony seats, smoke your cigars by the fire, and talk about how important you are. And it was located right at this corner, southeast corner of 4th, which is going this way, and then Pine, which is the crossing street here. So that's what that building was originally used for. I actually think it was a house initially, but this is the location that Woon, Gueng, and again, perceivably at least one other person were going to, and they were going here because one of the 4 intended victims lived here. And their target, in what again used to be the house back here at this intersection, was a man named Lee Tai Hoy, a Tong member who had been targeted, reportedly to be murdered. And again, possibly 3 people, but at least definitely Woon and Gueng stormed the house. And I don't know if there was anybody living there. It seemed like more of the witnesses were people on the street that probably heard the gunfire and then saw people fleeing. But those 2 definitively were seen fleeing this place after they went inside the home here of Hoy and murdered him in cold blood. Now I'm pausing real quick right now just because when I went out to do this, I actually found a lot of articles on this case, but in none of them I could never find a real direct description of how this shooting event actually went down. And it was, of course, conveniently right after I finished shooting for this video. Within 24 hours, I found a newspaper article. I think it was from near the end of the trial, but it actually gave like a paragraph description of what happened. And what happened essentially was, it seems like Woon, Gueng, and their third party likely had Hoy's schedule down pretty well, because Hoy left the business that he worked at down on 1st Street, so a few blocks away. And the place he lived in was multi-story, so when he arrives, he starts going upstairs. And these 3 assassins are hiding, like just around the corner from the top of the staircase, near where he lives. And right as he got to the top of the staircase, they came out and fired. He was struck, and he just fell backwards and tumbled down the stairs to the bottom, where reportedly this tragically primarily comes from Hoy's wife, who he had a family that, you know, lived here with him, as families are, and she heard the gunfire, and she stepped outside just in time to see the 3 men had gone downstairs where Hoy's body was located, stood over it, and fired at least 5 more shots into him. It was an execution, is what it was, and she actually saw that part of it. She saw the complete and total execution of her own husband. And then, of course, the men fled. There were apparently witnesses outside that said they saw 3 men scatter, fleeing from the building with their guns, you know, still smoking, which maybe that was written in the newspapers for dramatic effect, but that is how the actual murder event happened, the shooting itself. So in the aftermath of this case, the 3 living here at 2nd and Oak, Woon, Gueng, and Bong, I'm just gonna have to remember them that way best I can, they don't really help themselves, because you think after you commit a crime like that, the idea is to get where you need to go, lay low, don't look suspicious. So they immediately return to their home here at Oak and 2nd, and there's witnesses to the crime, so there's already finger pointing being done. So the authorities, again, the old police headquarters is literally right here, so literally you'd walk out the front door, walk across the street, and knock on someone's door. It would have been that easy. And when they arrive, when police arrive on the scene, the door is locked and it's barricaded to the room that they had. So already a little bit suspicious. And the police are like, let us in, and the men inside are saying no. They're trying the best they can to say, no, you can't come in here. And eventually the authorities force their way in there. They see Gueng and Bong. They apprehend them. They find, you know, multiple guns in the room, and then they find Woon hiding in a side room. So they're able to apprehend him as well. So they apprehend these guys pretty quickly, but not without near drama. I mean, it seems like we were just a few steps away from a police tong shootout in the room that these guys were staying in. And as far as this 3rd guy goes, there was a man named Yi Gong. Apparently I said the wrong name. Yi Gong, who has been stipulated was this 3rd individual that was involved. And there was further connection to all this. There was reportedly a rooming house run by Chinese people, and it stood at Pine between 5th and 6th. Well, this is 5th Crossing, and this is Pine right here. Today, part of the U.S. Bank Corps Tower, it extends across here, so there is no stretch between Pine between 5th and 6th, because this is all here now, but the rooming house would have been located there at one time. And this apparently was the address where it was believed that locals may have been harboring an assassin or some assassins. And this 3rd potential assassin, this Gong guy, he was thought to have been staying there while he was in Portland, and he was never apprehended afterward. It seems like he possibly just split town or whatever. He was never apprehended in this case as a witness, as possibly being involved, but there was, again, at least one witness that said they saw him fleeing the scene. And again, you know, the place he was staying at is right back here, where, you know, this looks more like, you know, couple stories, office towers. That's where he was believed to have been staying. And then I turn, and here's where Hoy lived. So less than 2 blocks apart they would have been. So he was right in the vicinity. Pretty much the same distance this way as the other ones involved would have been that way. Walking through construction. So it was more or less a foregone conclusion. You have witnesses. You know that there's tong wars going on. You know that this one particular guy was targeted. So, you know, and, oh, suspicious. Oh, he actually ended up turning up dead. One of the guys was known to have literally just split town when he knew his name was possibly coming up on the list. I don't think any of the 3, at least in that time period, the 3 survivors, I don't think any of them were got to, at least within that time frame. I don't know if they got murdered later on. Again, this was hardly the only, you know, gangland killing in the Chinese neighborhood of Portland during what was, you know, decades of time. But you couple witnesses, you couple the fact that these guys pretty much barricaded themselves in their, you know, room at 2nd and Oak, which is suspicious, and then you combine, you know, Portland, you know, almost totally white Portland, or at least the people that had power were white, and their perspectives towards people not white, be they African American, Chinese, Japanese, Asian, of any other sort, what have you. So usually not a lot of sympathy to be passed down in cases like this. So these guys were likely going to go down for this crime. But a lot of stuff happened before it was all said and done. And so in addition to a few witnesses seeing these guys flee, they took Woon and Gueng to the hospital because Hoy actually survived for a little while after his attack, long enough for them to take these 2 guys to the hospital. And reportedly he was, you know, he was dying. He was not going to last much longer. So he couldn't really speak. He couldn't point. But yeah, they apparently brought Woon in, and they just kind of propped him in front of Hoy and like pointed to him like, is this the guy? And they claimed that Hoy kind of nodded best he could. Now, I don't know if there was any actual officers of the law, legal representation or anything like that in the room, or if this was just, I think it was, there was an attorney there who I want to say was going to probably prosecute in the case, or at least be part of the prosecution. So it's a little sketchy that this is what they established as an official identification. And apparently the same thing happened when they brought Gueng in. They brought him in, held him up, looked at Hoy, and Hoy kind of nodded best he could, and that was how they deemed that was him identifying his assailants. A little bit fishy, but maybe accurate. And in the aftermath of this, Woon would actually say that this didn't happen, that in his, I guess, correspondence with Hoy before he died, he was actually trying to implicate somebody else, and that Hoy had a friend of his there with him who essentially told Hoy, like, you have to identify these guys if you want your revenge. So you think, revenge for what? Revenge for being shot? Well, if he doesn't think these 2 guys are his killers, then what revenge is he getting? It could be somebody else did it, but he had other reasons to want to take out revenge on these 2 guys that his friend knew about. It was a very strange explanation for Woon to put forward in terms of trying to argue that no, he wasn't identified as a killer. That wasn't what Hoy was intending to say. So a very strange, bizarre official identification of your assailants, but that is officially how it happened, and that was, you know, instrumental in the trial proceedings against both these guys. And to further, you know, try to vindicate the story that was being pushed as to why this murder happened, was this idea that the Bow On Tong chapter, if you can use that term, was sending people to Portland. If that wasn't really believed at the start, when Woon was on trial, his trial was much more followed. It seemed like authorities felt like he was the leader, and Gueng was more an accomplice, something like that. But during Woon's trial, Woon, see, even I'm mixing it up now. He's there, you know, the trial proceedings are happening, they're not going great, and all of a sudden he goes into a panic and starts pointing out some men that are at the trial, probably sitting in, you know, the benches behind them, and he acknowledged them. He pretty much points them out and he says, like, those are other assassins. So he's probably in a full-on panic, thinking he's about to get wiped out in the courtroom while he's on trial. Like, he's in one position where he can't run for it. And they get pointed out. Any law enforcement in the room immediately rushes them. They try to push back and refrain, but the authorities get them stopped. And they're checked, and they identified themselves, and they both were carrying revolvers and handguns on them. Like, Woon was right. These guys walked into the courthouse in this city armed, and it's, you know, it was immediately perceived that they were connected to whoever was calling out these hits out of San Francisco. But in the end, the theory, I never really got any definitive, like, why these guys were here. But the prevailing theory was that they weren't there to get Woon, even though, you know, I mean, if the story is accurate, he was one of them. They think the more accurate reason for why they were there was maybe to gun down witnesses, because witnesses could reveal information that they saw that this faction out of San Francisco would maybe rather not people know. So it's thought that that was the reason that they showed up there. But I mean, talk about a system where you send assassins into Portland to murder these Tong members that you've disassociated from there on the other side now. And maybe these were some of those assassins, or maybe you're just sending more down, like, make sure things don't get out of hand in Portland in terms of what's going to go down with Woon and Yi Gueng. So that actually happened. You think court proceedings are crazy today, you think the O.J. Simpson trial is crazy. Try being on trial and there's, like, Chinese gang assassins walking into the courtroom, like, armed. Like, I don't think any other case in the city can quite match up with that. So the murder happens March 1907. By November, or sorry, 1908. March 1908, Woon is convicted of first-degree murder in November 1908. And a little later on, Yi Gueng would have his trial. And I think late spring 1909, he would face the same fate, getting convicted of first-degree murder, which was kind of expected to happen in the overall scheme of things. And both men would appeal. Gueng would get a new trial almost immediately. And Woon, who again, the attitude was kind of, he was the main leader guy, so he didn't seem to get the same leniency. He would appeal and appeal and appeal. He got his case taken to the state Supreme Court. They upheld the first-degree conviction, which meant hanging, death by hanging. But he kept getting that delayed because he ultimately got his case up to the United States Supreme Court, and even they upheld the original decision. But, you know, with how long all that takes, here he was getting convicted in late 1908, and it's, you know, almost like 3-4 years pass in this time. But he's, you know, it's certified by the United States Supreme Court, so there's really nowhere else to go from there. And Woon is awaiting the noose in 1913, and I think within a couple days of his scheduled hanging, Oregon Governor Oswald West, who was a master of commuting death sentences to life imprisonment or something else, he did it all the time. And for Woon, he got lucky enough. The governor stepped in at the final bell and gave him clemency. Is that the right word? And he was, his death sentence was commuted to life. And not so far down the road, 1915, Woon actually got a pardon from Governor West with the stipulation that he would immediately return home to China. I don't know if he was a first-generation American with his family, but that was the stipulation, was he would return to China the moment he was released. And it appears he did this. He returned to China. And then, for whatever reason, 1927, it's 12 years later, Woon is like in his early 60s now. For some reason, he comes back to America. And I mean, the moment that happens, he's cited, he's arrested, and he's actually returned to prison to finish his life sentence, because the stipulation was, as long as you don't come back to, you know, it was probably don't come back to America, but, you know, for our sake, don't come back to Portland, you'll be fine. But if we catch you in Portland again, your pardon is getting revoked. And that's what happened in 1927. Woon was returned to prison in Oregon. And he would serve some 8 years in prison until 1935, when he was pardoned again. By this time, he was 70 years old. He probably didn't have a whole lot of life left in him. The case had happened almost 3 decades earlier. And I think, you know, fortunately for the city of Portland, because, you know, Portland's never had a great racial history. So when you see things like this, you at least kind of feel a little bit better about the city. Their attitude was, you know, even though we think you did this, you've done enough prison time, you're elderly, you're 70 years old, we want you to be able to go back home and finish out your final years with your family in China. Just don't come back to Portland. And I found no further articles about Woon, so I assume, hey, that rhymed. I assume when he got pardoned yet again with the same stipulations, he saw to it to not take the risk and never return to Portland again. And Gueng would also ultimately be pardoned as well. So neither one of them actually was put to death. They both cheated the hangman's noose. And both, I assume, I don't know about Gueng, but I know at least for Woon, presumption is that they were able to live out full lives despite what they most likely did. I mean, there's still some suspicious elements to this story that make me question if we really know all that happened, whether we can really say we're 100% certain we know who the killers were in this case of Lee Tai Hoy. But whatever the case, it's just a crazy, bizarre story. So it was definitely, if I was going to address any Tong-related murders in the Chinese section of Portland, I knew this was probably going to be the first one, the one that would get my most interest in terms of doing a story related to that. This is hardly the only death in Portland as in relation to Tong wars that were going on. There were many, but this one just maybe had the wildest story that it was all wrapped up into. And all that said, that is it. That is the story of the murder of Lee Tai Hoy, possibly at the hands of Woon and Ye Gueng, and maybe this other guy that kind of just vanished and never came back, never was captured. Nobody knows what happened to him. Maybe he came from San Francisco and fled back to San Francisco. Maybe the heat was even hotter than that, and he fled all the way back to China. I don't know. Nobody knows. Even the newspapers, their attitude was he was just never seen after this murder took place, which kind of implies his guilt, honestly. And yeah, that's it. So remember, as always, gang, like, share, subscribe, comment, keep it nice. And Patreon, don't forget that. And it's getting hot. Until next time, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian with another episode of Historic Murders of Portland.